So I'm going to tie together a whole bunch of stuff that we've been looking at by talking about the sort of golden age of Pericles, some of the philosophy and some of the ideas that are underlaying a lot of the classical works we'll be looking at. So if you look at the timeline, you can see it runs from about 480 to 350. There are, you could claim that really the height of the golden age of Pericles, or the high classic periods, from about 450 to about really 380, maybe even later or earlier than that, like 450, it ran for about 30 years, to about 420 or 410. But one of the things that we know, that we get stuff from the ancient Greek world, and when you look at, for instance, these are stills from Star Trek, and we have these jokes in the Olympic Games, Greeks ran races, jumped, hurled biscuits, and threw the Java. That's funny because we know what those things mean. And so this guy in a toga with a very muscular physique, with the leaves in his hair that are made out of gold, we know that that somehow looks classical. The temple behind him, which is massive and white and has these columns on it, we know that that represents the Greek classic world. So immediately it's sort of an iconography or a symbology that we understand. If you take out, for instance, a $5 bill, or actually any coin, there are going to be all of these references to the ancient Greek world. And so, for instance, memorials in Washington, we find they all are built using the vernacular of Greek architecture. And we can see that any kind of monument uses the post and lintel columns that we've come from ancient Greece. And they're usually painted white, or they are made out of white marble, because that's how we found these buildings. But actually, they would have painted a lot of these buildings in bright, crazy colors. So in order to understand the classical Greek world, we need to take a look at some of the elements and some of the architectural elements to understand them. And there are some simple ways of understanding these elements. Now, the diagram we're looking at, I think, is really important. And I want you to think about the idea that these architectural elements are things that you have to memorize for your class, and they will give you a lot of enjoyment when you're looking at things later. I know that you probably don't want to hear that, but first of all, we have three main architectural orders. They are architectural styles, and the term for column in the, I think in the Greek and in the Latin world, was stylos, S-T-Y-L-O-S. And that's where we get our word style. So these are styles of columns. You can see the relationship between that. The orders are actually named after where they supposedly came from, the Doric, Ionia, Corinth. Those are names of places. Now, this is also shows kind of an evolution, because the earliest and most masculine order is the Doric order. The later kind of column that we see, especially when we get to the Acropolis in 450, is the Ionic column. And then much later, around 350, we have this Corinthian order, which is really over the top and has a fancy sort of capital on it. So let's analyze these things and talk about them a little bit. First of all, the Doric order. It's the simplest and most masculine. It doesn't have a base. It doesn't have any shoes on it, so basically the shaft runs straight into the base of the building, called the stylobate. And then the top of it, you see it has something called a capital, and the capital is made out of an abacus, which is a sort of impost block between the echinus and the architrave. And the term echinus actually comes from the Greek word for sea urchin, because it kind of has that look that a sea urchin has, if you ever seen like the half dome of a sea urchin. And usually the columns have fluting, which allows you to ignore the sort of way that columns are constructed, which is out of drums. Above that, you have a sort of horizontal beam that's called the architrave. And the architrave, frieze, and cornice are the entablature of the building, and they represent or have a lot of the ornaments on them. Now, originally all of these ornaments would have been made out of wood, and so there are leftover elements that would have been useful in wooden form but are no longer useful now. So for instance, the triglyphs that we see, tri means three, glyph means mark, we have three marks. That would have been the end of actually wooden beams. And the thing between it, called the metope, you may hear a different pronunciation of that. I think not metope, but metope or something like that is how I've heard it pronounced. But the metope Actually, in original Greek buildings would have been a ceramic panel that was used just basically to keep the birds out and would have had decorations and paintings on it. So we've got this very simple early order, the Doric order, and that was used for the Parthenon. The Ionic order has these volutes, or rounded sort of shapes on it, and those are in the capital. And you can see that the entablature of the Ionic order is a little bit fancier. It has some extra little elements in it, but it's missing two of the elements that we saw before, the triglyph and the metope. And that's one of the ways that you can tell that it's got an Ionic entablature on the top of it. The capital of the column has those volutes and also has a little extra ornamentation of things that look like little eggs and darts that run between them. And then it's actually wearing a pair of shoes, or it's got a base on it. And so it's considered sort of a feminine thing. And the way that I've always remembered it is the volutes make it look like the capital letter I, so it's Ionic. The Corinthian is kind of the RuPaul or Carmen Miranda version of the columns of the orders, because it comes much later and comes in the Hellenistic period, which makes a lot of sense now that you know about Hellenistic sculpture. And it has a basket of acanthus leaves, which are actually sort of dandelion greens. You can make a salad out of it, and has some vestiges left over of a curlicue hair design in the volutes at the top as well. So we can see that that's the evolution, or a natural evolution, of these sort of orders over time, and generally historians kind of give them a gender. Now, the next sort of idea that is important in the classical Greek world, besides what we talked about with Plato in the sculpture lesson, is that we get a lot of our mathematical ideas and a lot of our philosophical ideas from ancient Greece as well. So Pythagoras, that guy, I think it was a squared plus b squared equals c squared, the measurements of the triangle and those kinds of things. He's this mathematician, and if you look at his dates, he comes from well before Plato. Plato is much later, like about 200 years later. So Pythagoras comes up with this idea that numbers are divine for him. Numbers are a representation of the rational world, but that underlying the world we live in is this system that's almost godlike, and that they run under everything. He called this symmetria, and that makes a lot of sense. And we've kind of taken the term symmetria and distorted it a little bit. But the idea of symmetria for us, or symmetry, is same measurement. Sim meaning the same, metros meaning measure. And so if you look at this building, the Parthenon that we're going to study really much in depth, it's symmetrical. You can cut it down the center and it looks completely equal on either side, at least in the front part. And so that symmetry is a beautiful idea, and therefore kalos is involved in this. And the other thing that's kind of interesting or beautiful about it, for at least they would have found beautiful about it, is also some of the ways that numbers are used to alter your perception. So for instance, if you look at the front of the building, you'll see it actually has 8 columns across the front. Now the long side, down the side of that building, it has actually 17 columns. Now, you're probably thinking, well, that's kind of stupid, or why is that important? Well, doesn't it look like it's 3 times longer than the front, at least in that photo on the right-hand side? That's kind of an expression of how to use numbers in a beautiful way and how to alter how you perceive things. And so I think that's kind of an important idea in terms of the ancient Greek world, that you have these Pythagorean ratios, and you've got 17:8 ratio, and you've got these playing with numbers that, if you understand numbers, if you understand mathematics, if you understand symmetry, it's beautiful, and it's part of the kalos, and it's part of the ideal that we'll come upon when we get to Plato, actually around the end of the 400s, the beginning 380s or so, when Plato is alive. He's really the heir to this kind of rational thinking and logical thinking. And I think that one of the most important things that you can get out of this is that the buildings are rational, they're logical, they follow systems, they follow styles, they're usually symmetrical, and when they're not symmetrical, when they have irrational numbers in them, they're purposefully done in that way. And so those are some of the ideas that underlie Greek art, especially when we look at the Acropolis, when we study that next.